The first time I met Mike, I felt as though someone had gently stitched together the pieces of me I had thought were beyond repair. He wasn't like anyone I'd known before, calm, attentive, and fully present in a way that felt disarming. I remember the way he looked at me during our first conversation, as if I was the only thing in the world worth listening to. We quickly fell into each other's orbits, spending hours walking the cobbled streets of Boston, talking about books, laughing at movies, and building castles in the air about the life we could share. When he asked me to move in with him, I didn't hesitate. His home in New England sounded like a dream, a sprawling house by the lake, surrounded by endless stretches of trees. It felt like a new chapter, a clean slate, a place where happiness wasn't a fleeting moment but something solid, something permanent. The day I moved in, the house welcomed me like an old friend. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floors. The scent of fresh pine from the forest mixed with the crisp lake air. "You're going to love it here," Mike had said, wrapping his arms around me as we stood by the dock, watching the sun dip below the horizon. And for a time, I did. We settled into a routine that felt like living inside a postcard. I'd wake up to the sound of birdsong, and Mike would make coffee before heading out to work. Evenings were ours, cooking together, sharing stories, laughing. Those moments felt sacred. But happiness, I would learn, can sometimes be fragile, and new beginnings don't always erase the past. At first, I chalked up my unease to the adjustments of moving. The house was bigger than I was used to, its quietness often overwhelming when Mike wasn't home. But his warmth and reassurance were enough to push those feelings aside. "It's just us now," he'd say, and I'd smile, believing him. The house that once felt alive now felt cold. Mike was always away, meetings, trips, promises that it was just for now. I tried to fill the silence, painting, fixing up the garden, long walks by the lake, but no matter what I did, the loneliness crept in. One evening, Mike called. His voice was careful. "Zach's going to stay with us for a while. I think you'll like having someone around." His son? We'd only met a few times, and he'd always seemed distant, almost closed off. "When is he coming?" I asked, masking my unease. "Friday," Mike said quickly. "It'll be good for you both." I hung up, staring at the empty house around me. For the first time, I wasn't sure if his presence would be a comfort or something else entirely. Zach arrived on a rainy Friday evening. He stepped into the house carrying a duffel bag, tall and athletic, with an energy that seemed both restrained and restless. His handshake was firm but cold, and his brief smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks for having me," he said, his tone polite but distant. Dinner that night was quiet. He answered my questions with clipped replies, and the tension in the air felt almost tangible. I told myself it was just the awkwardness of new company. The next morning, I asked him to help me clear the garden. He agreed without hesitation, though his expression was unreadable. We worked side by side in near silence, the only sounds coming from the rustling leaves and the scrape of tools. Slowly, the quiet began to feel less oppressive. Later that evening, over coffee, he opened up unexpectedly. "This place feels familiar," he said, staring out the window. "My dad used to bring me here when I was a kid, but he was always too busy to notice I hated it." His words caught me off guard, but I didn't interrupt. He spoke of his childhood, of feeling invisible, like a piece of the furniture in his father's life. For the first time, I saw the vulnerability behind his guarded exterior. "I guess it's just hard to forget," he added softly. I nodded, unsure of what to say but feeling the weight of his words. Somehow, in that moment, the space between us felt a little smaller. Over the next few days, something between Zach and me began to shift. It wasn't something we spoke about, just a quiet, unspoken tension that seemed to linger in the air. I told myself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of two people sharing space. But there were moments I couldn't ignore. One afternoon, we were rearranging furniture in the living room. As we both reached for a book on the table, our hands touched. It was such a brief, innocent moment, but the jolt it sent through me was anything but. I glanced at him, and for the first time, I caught something in his expression, something hesitant, searching, that mirrored what I was feeling. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every detail of that touch, every glance, every word he'd spoken. I felt restless, guilty, and unable to explain why. The next morning, I found Zach in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a mug of coffee. His eyes met mine, softer than they had ever been. He hesitated, as if searching for the right thing to say. "You're up early," I said, breaking the silence. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted, his gaze lingering. We stood there, the tension between us growing heavier, and then, as if pulled by an invisible force, we found ourselves inches apart. My breath caught as he leaned closer, and before I could stop myself, our lips met. The kiss was brief but electric, charged with 1,000 emotions I couldn't name. The moment it ended, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, my heart pounding. "This can't happen," I whispered, my voice trembling. Zach said nothing, just nodded slowly, but the look in his eyes told me he felt the same conflict. I turned and left the kitchen, my thoughts a chaotic storm, knowing everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The day after the kiss, the house felt heavier, every corner charged with unspoken words. I avoided Zach, but I could still feel his presence, the way his gaze lingered when he thought I wasn't looking. It was unbearable. When Mike returned from his trip, I tried to act normal, but the tension was palpable. Over dinner, Zach was quiet, barely meeting anyone's eyes, while I forced smiles and small talk. Mike didn't seem to notice, until our glances lingered a moment too long. That night, as Mike got ready for bed, he paused. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but searching. I hesitated, my stomach twisting. "Of course, just tired," I said quickly, avoiding his gaze. But I knew this couldn't continue. The weight of what had happened, of what could still happen, was suffocating. The next evening, I found Zach in the garden, sitting on the old bench near the lake. His shoulders were hunched, his usual confidence replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady, though my hands trembled. He looked up, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with a quiet desperation. "I can't do this," I said firmly. "What happened?" "It was a mistake. I love Mike, and this isn't fair to him or to us." Zach's jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded, though his eyes betrayed the hurt he was trying to hide. "I get it," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you felt it too, didn't you?" I didn't answer, because the truth was written all over my face. Instead, I stepped back, forcing myself to turn away. "This has to end," I said softly, more to myself than to him. As I walked back to the house, I felt a sharp ache in my chest, like something inside me had been torn apart. Later that night, I heard the sound of Zach's car pulling out of the driveway. I didn't look out the window, didn't watch him leave. When I lay in bed next to Mike, his steady breathing the only sound in the room, I stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my choice settle over me. I had done what I thought was right, but as the silence wrapped itself around me, I wondered if I'd ever feel whole again.